We moved into the neighborhood expecting a fresh start, a quiet, upscale community where our son Jake could feel safe. We had no idea we were walking straight into enemy territory. I should have seen the warning signs from the beginning. The first week in our new home, a neatly folded HOA letter appeared in our mailbox. Not a friendly welcome, not an introduction to the community. A fine. Unauthorized wheelchair ramp installation, violation of HOA aesthetic guidelines. That was our welcome. A fine for making our own home accessible for our 15-year-old son, Jake. Jake had been through enough in life. Born with cerebral palsy, he'd spent years enduring surgeries, physical therapy, and the exhausting reality of a body that didn't always cooperate. But despite it all, he never complained. He never played the victim. Jake had a sharp mind, a kind heart, and more resilience than most adults I knew. So when my wife and I saw that letter, we were irritated, but we let it slide. Big mistake. Because that fine was just the beginning. At the top of that HOA letter was a name that, at the time, meant nothing to me. A name I would soon learn to hate. Karen. Karen wasn't just the HOA president. She was the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. The woman who decided who belonged and who didn't. And from day one, she had decided that we didn't. But the real war didn't begin with Karen. It began with her son, Kyle. If you picture the typical spoiled, arrogant high school bully, you're picturing Kyle. Entitled, smug, untouchable. He was the kid who thought the world revolved around him, and in a way, it did. His mother's HOA power extended far beyond neighborhood rules. She had influence with the school, the teachers, the local businesses. She had people wrapped around her perfectly manicured finger. And that meant Kyle could do whatever he wanted. At first it was subtle. Snide comments as he walked past Jake in the hallways. Fake sympathy. "Oh no, did your battery die? Guess we'll have to leave you here." Jake, being Jake, just rolled his eyes and ignored it. But Kyle wasn't the type to stop when he didn't get a reaction. He pushed. Harder. Faster. Crueler. He started spreading rumors about Jake at school, whispering to anyone who would listen that teachers only gave him good grades because they felt sorry for him, that he was getting special treatment, that he wasn't really that smart, he just had an advantage. When Jake told me about it, he shrugged like it didn't bother him. But I saw the way his hands clenched in his lap. I saw the way he spent more time in his room after school, his headset on, diving deeper into his computer games to escape reality. I reported the bullying to the school. They did nothing. A slap on the wrist. A talk with Kyle, where he probably smiled, apologized, and walked out feeling more powerful than ever. The next day, Kyle walked past Jake in the hallway, smirked, and said, "Nice try, Wheels. Better luck next time." I should have known then. This wasn't going to stop on its own. The first real attack happened in the school library. Jake had found a quiet corner, his nose buried in his favorite sci-fi book, escaping into a world far better than this one. But Kyle wasn't about to let him have even that. Jake felt it before he saw them. The low chuckles, the sudden shift in energy, that gut feeling that tells you you're being watched. Kyle strolled up to the table, flipped a chair around, and plopped down across from Jake. His two cronies flanked him, blocking the aisle. "Hey, Wheels, what are you reading?" Jake didn't look up. "Something you wouldn't understand." For a second, Kyle's smirk faltered. Then, the mask of arrogance returned. He snatched the book from Jake's hands. Jake's jaw tightened. "Give it back." Kyle ignored him, flipping through the pages dramatically. "Wow, this is some nerd stuff. You sure you don't just look at the pictures?" Jake reached for it. Kyle held it higher, just out of reach. Kyle grinned. "Come on, Wheels. Take it." Jake's fists clenched on his wheels. The other kids in the library watched, some giggling, some pretending not to see. Kyle tilted his head, pretending to think. Tell you what, beg for it. Silence. Jake didn't move, didn't speak. Kyle waited. The game wasn't fun anymore. Kyle's smirk faded. His friends shifted awkwardly, expecting a bigger reaction. Then, Kyle made his mistake. He looked away, just for a second, just long enough to gloat to his friend. And in that split second, Jake moved. With one swift motion, he rolled his chair forward and snatched the book right out of Kyle's hand. Kyle's jaw dropped. His eyes went wide. Jake calmly placed the book back on the table, met Kyle's stunned gaze. You were saying? The tension shifted. Kyle's friends shifted uncomfortably. A few kids snickered. Kyle clenched his jaw, fists tightening, embarrassed, humiliated. He stood up so fast the chair toppled over. His face burned red as he stormed out of the library. His friends trailed behind, one muttering, "Dude, what the hell?" Jake let out a slow breath. His hands were still shaking. He had won, but he knew Kyle wasn't going to forget this. And he was right. Because the very next day, Kyle took things too far. After school, Jake and his best friend Ethan were making their way to the pickup zone. They were just talking about an upcoming robotics competition when the air shifted. Jake felt it, that same gut feeling. Then they stepped out of the alleyway, 5 of them. Kyle led the charge, flanked by his usual gang. "Look at this," Kyle sneered. The cripple brought backup. Ethan stepped in front of Jake. "Leave us alone, Kyle." Kyle laughed. "Oh, so protective. What are you, his boyfriend?" His goons laughed. Ethan didn't. Kyle's face darkened. Then he lunged. He shoved Ethan hard, sending him stumbling backward into a bush. Jake barely had time to react before 2 of Kyle's friends grabbed his wheelchair. They yanked it backward. Jake's stomach lurched. They tipped the chair, and suddenly Jake was falling. His shoulder slammed onto the pavement. His arms scraped against the rough asphalt. Kyle stood over him, laughing. "Look at him, guys," Kyle sneered. "Right where he belongs." Jake's head spun. His palms burned. And then Kyle kicked his wheelchair into the street. Jake clenched his teeth. Ethan groaned from the ground. Kyle crouched down, his voice mockingly soft. "Next time, Wheels, stay out of my way." Then they walked away, laughing, victorious. Jake lay there staring up at the sky. And that night, when he finally told me what happened, something deep inside me snapped. This wasn't just bullying anymore. This was war. And Kyle had no idea who he had just messed with. I knocked on the door hard enough to shake the frame. Boom, boom, boom. I wasn't here to be polite. I heard the heavy shuffle of footsteps on the other side, then the door yanked open. Richard stood there, still in his sweatpants and an old military t-shirt. He squinted at me, an annoyed smirk already forming on his face. "What the hell do you want?" he grunted. I took a slow step forward, closing the space between us. "We need to talk." Richard let out a short, dry laugh. "Do we? Because I don't remember inviting you over." Kyle was sitting on the couch behind him, a gaming controller in his hands, eyes wide as he saw me standing there. He didn't say a word. I turned back to Richard. My voice was calm, controlled, deadly. "Your son and his little gang attacked my kid today." Richard smirked. "That right? You got proof?" I took another step forward. He either had to step back or let me walk straight through him. He moved. "I don't need proof," I said. "My son came home covered in bruises. He doesn't lie. Your kid does." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Boys will be boys. Maybe your son should grow a backbone. I felt my fingers twitch, the instinct to grab him by the throat almost overwhelming. I had been trained for combat, for survival, for war zones far worse than this. I had faced men far more dangerous than this smug, middle-aged fraud in front of me. But nothing had ever made my blood boil like this. I leaned in, lowering my voice to a whisper. You think this is a joke? You think because your wife runs the HOA, you're untouchable? Richard's smirk didn't fade. I think you're standing in my house, barking orders like a tough guy, when you're really just some washed-up vet looking for a fight. Wrong move. With one smooth motion, I grabbed the front of his shirt and lifted him off the ground. Kyle gasped. Richard let out a choked noise, his hands scrambling to pry my fingers off. But I held firm. Listen to me carefully, I said, my voice steady. I don't care how many times you've weaseled your son out of trouble with fake apologies. That ends tonight. I held him there for a few seconds longer, watching his face turn red, watching the arrogance drain from his eyes. Then I let go. He stumbled backward, coughing, gasping for air. His hand flew to his throat. You're out of your damn mind, he wheezed. I adjusted my jacket. Maybe, but I'll tell you what I am for sure. I took another step forward, towering over him. I am the last person you want as an enemy. Kyle hadn't moved from the couch. His hands trembled slightly on his controller. For the first time, he looked like a scared little boy. Good. Just then, the sound of heels clicking against the tile echoed from the hallway. And then, there she was. Karen. She strutted into the room, wearing a satin robe, holding a glass of wine like she was the damn Queen of England. She stopped when she saw me, her perfectly shaped eyebrows lifting slightly. Then she laughed. Laughed. Well, 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 she said, sipping her wine. If it isn't our little neighborhood charity case. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with her. Excuse me? Karen smirked, taking another sip. You must be here about your little situation. She waved a dismissive hand. Look, I get it. Your son's, you know. She didn't say the word. She didn't need to. Jake's disability. The thing she never said out loud, but always weaponized when she thought no one was listening. But that's not our problem now, is it? She continued, her smirk widening. I mean, kid's roughhouse. If your son can't handle that, maybe he shouldn't be around normal kids. I took a slow breath, pushing down the urge to snap her spine in half. Karen wasn't fazed. Or maybe if you focused on raising him right instead of, what was it, running around playing soldier? That was it. Before I even thought about what I was doing, I ripped the wine glass straight out of her hand and threw it across the room. It shattered against the wall. A red stain splattered across her pristine white walls. Karen gasped, stumbling back, eyes wide with shock. Richard tried to step forward. You son of a... I turned sharply, pointing a single finger at him. Say one more word, Richard. See what happens. He shut his mouth. I turned back to Karen, watching her smugness fade. You think this is a game? I said, my voice low. You think you can spit on my son and walk away? Karen blinked, her lips parting slightly. The silence in the room stretched. I leaned in, just close enough that she could feel the weight of my words. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Karen scoffed, straightening her robe, trying to regain control. Oh, please. What are you going to do? Call the police? I smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a reassuring smile. A smile that said, you just lost everything, and you don't even know it yet. No, Karen, I said softly. I'm not calling the cops. I turned for the door. But before stepping outside, I glanced over my shoulder. But by the time I'm done, you'll wish I had. Karen didn't say a word. Neither did Richard. Kyle just sat there, staring at the floor. I walked out of the house and into the night. The war had officially begun. And Karen? She had no idea just how badly she was about to lose. The days following our confrontation were eerily quiet. Karen was the type of person who thrived on control. The HOA, the neighborhood, the school board, she had her hands in everything. And for the first time, she was powerless. She had spit on my son in front of half the neighborhood. She had embarrassed herself. People were talking. Whispers in the grocery store. Side glances when she walked down the street. She knew she had screwed up. But Karen, she wasn't the type to back down. No, she was the type to plot. It started small. A second HOA fine appeared in my mailbox. Excessive noise violation, 100 fine. I frowned. Our house was silent as a grave after 9 p.m. The next day, another letter. Trash cans left out past HOA pickup time, $75 fine. The trash had been out for 30 minutes. Then, a third letter. Lawn maintenance violation, 150 fine. I stepped outside, staring at my perfectly cut lawn. She was pushing, testing me. She wanted to see if I would bend. I didn't. I ignored every letter. And that's when Karen decided to make it personal. One evening, I pulled into the driveway after a long day at work. Jake was in the front yard, rolling his wheelchair down the sidewalk, practicing some turns and speed control. And then I heard it. Karen's voice, sharp, angry. "You and your family don't belong here." I turned my head so fast my neck nearly snapped. Karen was towering over Jake. One hand on her hip, the other gesturing toward him like he was a problem to be solved. Jake's hands gripped the wheels of his chair. His shoulders were tense. His head was down. That was the part that broke me. Jake never bowed his head to anyone. But in that moment, he was small, cornered. Karen's voice dripped with venom. "I am sick and tired of your father acting like he owns this neighborhood," she hissed. "Maybe if you weren't such a weak little brat, my son wouldn't have had to teach you a lesson." And then, she spat on him, right there, right in our own driveway. A thick, wet glob landed on Jake's jacket. Jake flinched. The entire world went silent. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I stepped out of the car, moving toward them in a slow, measured pace. Karen must have felt it. The shift in energy. Her smirk faltered. The neighbors had seen it. Half the street had stopped what they were doing. Watering lawns, unloading groceries, walking dogs. They saw. She knew she had gone too far. I reached Jake first. I kneeled beside him, took my sleeve, and wiped the spit off his jacket. "You okay?" I asked. Jake nodded, but his jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitch. "Go inside," I told him. He hesitated. "Now." He turned his chair and rolled into the house without a word. And then I turned to Karen. The woman who had spent years getting away with everything. The woman who had just assaulted my son in broad daylight. She crossed her arms. "You should be grateful we even let you." I took a step forward. She shut her mouth. I took another step. For the first time since I met her, Karen took a step back. My voice was quiet, controlled. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Karen let out a sharp scoff, tossing her hair over her shoulder like this was still her show. "Oh, come on. He was being disrespectful." I took another step forward. She backed up again. Her usual confidence was cracking. From the front porch, Richard stepped outside, his face scrunched in confusion. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" She waved him off. "Just handling a problem." I tilted my head slightly. A problem? I echoed. Karen rolled her eyes. You're really acting like this is a big deal? What? You gonna call the cops? I took a deep, slow breath. Then I smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a forgiving smile. A smile that said, you just lost everything, and you don't even know it yet. No, Karen, I said softly. But by the time I'm done, you'll wish I had. Her smirk faded. I turned, walking back toward my house. This wasn't just about teaching Karen a lesson. This was about erasing her completely. I started with Richard, the man who had spent years pretending to be a Navy SEAL. The one who wore the shirts, told the stories, shook hands with veterans at the bar, and soaked up their respect. I had suspicions about him from the beginning. Real SEALs? We recognize each other. The way a man carries himself. The way he moves. The way he reacts to the unexpected. Richard had none of it. I ran his name through a private SEAL database. Nothing. Then I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. His military records. He never made it past boot camp. He had lied about everything. And I was going to expose him in the worst way possible. The annual Veterans Day fundraiser was the biggest event of the year, packed with real veterans, community leaders, local politicians. Richard was always front and center, wearing his fake SEAL cap, spinning his fake war stories. So, that night, when the retired Marine Colonel took the stage and asked for all the veterans in the room to stand up, Richard stood, chest puffed out, smug as ever. The Colonel's eyes landed on him. You, sir, he said. Which branch? Richard grinned. Navy SEAL. A few people clapped harder. The Colonel nodded. A SEAL, huh? Damn fine men. What team? Richard hesitated, just for a second. Then he said, Team 4. I smiled. Bullshit. The Colonel grinned. Well, hell. What class? Richard took a sip of his drink, acting casual. Class of 81. Silence. The Colonel leaned forward. That's interesting, he said, because I trained Class 81. Dead. Silence. Richard's face twitched. His smirk disappeared. Then I stood up, stretching my arms. Hey, Richard, I called across the room. What was your BUDS phase? Richard's eyes darted to me. His hands twitched. He had no idea what I was talking about. All of them? Someone snickered. Wrong answer. I pulled out my phone. I already checked, I said, turning the screen around. You never made it past boot camp. Gasps. The Colonel chuckled. We got ourselves a stolen valor situation. A retired Army Ranger stood up, arms crossed. Take off the SEAL cap. Richard's face turned red. The crowd murmured, Take it off. The chant grew. Richard looked at Karen. For the first time in his entire life, Karen couldn't save him. He ripped the SEAL cap off his head and stormed out. Karen, she was next. Karen ruled the neighborhood like a queen. She had spent years controlling people with fear, using the HOA as her personal weapon. She fined people for minor infractions, manipulated votes, and crushed anyone who dared challenge her. But now, the foundation of her empire was cracking. Richard's humiliation at the Veterans Day event spread like wildfire. Within days, the entire neighborhood knew the truth. He was a fraud, a stolen valor parasite who had spent years basking in respect he never earned. Karen had spent so long using her husband's military service as a shield, leveraging his fake honor to make herself untouchable. But now, there was nothing left to protect her, and I was about to burn the rest of her kingdom to the ground. I started digging. For years, Karen had gotten away with her scams and corruption because no one had bothered to look deeper. So I did. And what I found It was enough to end her. First, I reviewed my own fines, every bogus HOA violation she had sent my way. Then I compared them to my neighbors. A pattern emerged. Families she didn't like. They were hit with fines constantly. Her friends? Not a single fine. Ever. People who questioned her? Suddenly violated HOA rules. The people who kept quiet? No issues. It was textbook corruption. But I needed proof. So I went deeper. I pulled public records, combed through HOA financial statements, and cross-referenced maintenance reports. And what did I find? Invoices for repairs that never happened. Payments to contractors that didn't exist. Huge sums of HOA money missing. Karen wasn't just a tyrant. She was a thief. And the best part? She was sloppy. I found someone on the inside. A former HOA treasurer, a woman Karen had pushed out months ago for not being a team player. She had been hesitant at first, but when I showed her the evidence I found, she cracked. She had emails. Emails where Karen pressured vendors to overcharge for services and took kickbacks. Emails where she ignored real maintenance requests, but approved expensive upgrades to her own house. Emails where she laughed about finding families she didn't like. But I wasn't done. Karen loved holding meetings in the HOA clubhouse. And the clubhouse, it had security cameras. One of my contacts secured the footage, and what I saw, it was game over. A clip of Karen accepting bribes. A recording of her mocking disabled residents. A moment where she literally said, "I run this HOA. These people don't get a say." I had everything, and I was about to show the entire neighborhood. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread that something big was about to happen. Neighbors who never bothered to attend showed up. Karen walked in, smug as ever. She took her seat at the front of the room, completely unaware that this was the last time she would ever sit in that chair. I stood up. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," I said, "there's something the community needs to see." Karen sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. "If this is another baseless complaint." I pressed play. The projector screen flickered to life. First, the financial fraud. Screenshots of HOA funds disappearing, invoices for non-existent work, payments to fake companies. Karen's smirk wavered. Then, the kickbacks. Emails of her overcharging vendors, pocketing the extra money, and rigging maintenance requests. The neighbors started murmuring. Karen sat up straighter. And then, the security footage. The moment she mocked a disabled family for needing a wheelchair ramp. The moment she bragged about rigging HOA votes. The moment she flat out said, "I run this HOA. These people don't get a say." Gasps. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man near the back shook his head. Karen's face drained of color. She stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled over. "This is taken out of context," she shrieked. "I was joking." But nobody was listening. "You stole from us." The voice came from the front row. A woman who had once been one of Karen's biggest supporters. More voices joined in. "You used our HOA money for yourself. You threatened us with fake fines. You bullied families out of the neighborhood." Karen's hands shook. Her perfect little house of cards was collapsing. One of the board members stood up. "I'm calling for an emergency vote." Within minutes, the vote was cast. Karen was stripped of her title, her name erased from every HOA document. Her power, gone. She slammed her hands on the table. "This isn't over. You can't do this to me." A retired board member, a woman Karen had steamrolled for years, leaned back in her chair and smirked. "You built this HOA," she said. "Or did you steal from it?" Laughter rippled through the room. Karen's face burned red. She spun toward me. "This is your fault," she hissed. I didn't even blink. No, Karen. You did this to yourself. The next morning, Karen and Richard were packing up. They had no choice. The HOA had filed a legal complaint. The local authorities were investigating her financial crimes. The neighbors had turned against her. She had lost everything. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching them load boxes into a moving truck. From across the street, Mrs. Thompson, a woman Karen had fined endlessly, called out with a cheerful voice. Need help packing, Karen? Oh, wait. I forgot. You only like making other people move. Laughter spread down the street. Karen whipped around, seething. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she had no words. Richard stomped toward the truck, muttering curses under his breath. A neighbor, the same army ranger who had exposed his fake military record, grinned. Not so tough now, huh? Seal? More laughter. Richard's face burned red. He threw the last box in the truck and slammed the door. Karen climbed into the passenger seat, her arms crossed, her fury silent. Richard turned the key. Nothing. The car stalled. Chuckles rippled through the crowd. One of my neighbors, someone Richard had insulted at a BBQ, called out, "Looks like even your car doesn't support you." Karen slammed her hands against the dashboard, screaming. Richard stormed out of the car, stomped toward the moving truck, climbed in, and peeled out of the neighborhood, towing their dead car behind them. As they disappeared down the street, I felt Jake roll up beside me. "They're really gone?" he asked. I ruffled his hair, smiling. "They are. And they're never coming back."